He hadn't asked for her name. He hadn't even looked at her face. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Ryder Voss had simply pointed one thick finger at the nurse standing in the doorway of room 14 and said, loudly enough for the entire ward to hear, "I don't want her. Get me someone who's actually been in a war zone." The nurse didn't flinch. She didn't move back, didn't call for a supervisor, didn't do the thing people usually did when a decorated Marine commander turned his frustration on them like a weapon. She stood there, clipboard in hand, and looked at him the way someone looks at a storm they've already survived before. Her name was Olivia Marsh, and every single word he'd just said about her was wrong. If you're new here, please subscribe and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit like if you believe that real strength doesn't always wear a uniform, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning started the way bad mornings always did at Crestview Military Medical Center, with a patient who arrived angrier than his injury. The ambulance bay doors opened at 0647, and the gurney that rolled through them carried a man who was, by any objective measure, in serious trouble. His blood pressure was unstable, his right side was rigid and guarded, and the EMT pushing the stretcher looked like she'd spent the last 40 minutes silently praying he'd stop giving orders long enough to breathe. Marcus Ryder Voss, Lieutenant Colonel, United States Marine Corps, commander of the 3rd Expeditionary Strike Group out of Camp Lewick in Chesapeake, Virginia, was 53 years old and built like a man who had never once in his life considered the possibility that his body might fail him. He was broad across the shoulders, sharp through the jaw, and even flat on his back with an oxygen sensor clipped to his finger. He radiated the particular authority of someone who had spent 3 decades being the most capable person in any room he entered. He also, at this particular moment, had shrapnel migrating toward his hepatic artery. He didn't know that yet. He knew he was in pain, had been in pain for 3 weeks, on and off, the kind of deep ache that lived below the ribs and woke him at 2 in the morning. He'd ignored it through a battalion readiness review, a congressional liaison meeting, and 2 consecutive 14-hour days. He'd told his aide, Corporal Denise Falk, that it was a pulled muscle. He'd taken ibuprofen with black coffee and gotten back to work. It was Falk who had finally called the medic. She'd found him gripping the edge of his desk at 0600, jaw clenched, not speaking, which was the only version of a distress signal Marcus Voss was willing to emit. Now he was on a gurney in the intake bay of Crestview, and he was furious about it. "I need someone with field experience," he said, for what the EMT privately counted as the 4th time since leaving his quarters. "I need someone who understands combat injuries, not a civilian who learned medicine from a textbook." The intake nurse on duty that morning was a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had worked emergency admissions for 11 years and had heard most variations of this speech. She nodded, murmured something calm, and reached for the intake tablet. "We'll get you assessed right away, Colonel. Can you tell me when the pain started?" 3 weeks ago. "It's shrapnel. Legacy wound from Kandahar Province, 2009. I need a military medic or a trauma surgeon with combat deployment history. I don't want to explain to someone what an IED fragmentation pattern looks like." "Understood. We'll note that preference." He didn't like the word preference. You could hear it in the way his eyes moved to her face. But before he could answer, the triage coordinator, a compact man named Wesley Drum, who moved through the intake bay like he had ball bearings in his shoes, appeared at Patricia's elbow and said quietly, "Marsh is available. She's finishing up in 12. Patricia nodded. "Send her." Olivia Marsh was 49 years old. She had shoulder-length hair that had gone a deep gray at the temples over the last 5 years, which she'd stopped trying to hide somewhere around the time she'd stopped caring about the things she used to care about. She was medium height, medium build, the kind of woman who could stand in the middle of a crowded room and be entirely unnoticed. Not because she lacked presence, but because she had learned, years ago, how to choose when to be visible. She was finishing a wound dressing on a post-op patient in room 12 when Wesley leaned in. He gave her the summary in about 9 words. Marine Colonel, intake bay, legacy shrapnel, elevated liver enzymes, angry. She pulled off her gloves and grabbed a fresh pair from the dispenser. On my way. She didn't need more than that. She walked into the intake bay at 0658, clipboard in hand, and introduced herself the way she always did. First name, last name, her role. No performance, no warmth turned up past its natural level, No over-explaining. Colonel Voss, I'm Olivia Marsh, one of our senior nursing staff. I'm going to be helping coordinate your initial assessment. I need to ask you a few questions about your pain levels, and he interrupted her before she finished the sentence. It wasn't rude the way rudeness usually is, like, not personal, not calculated. It was the interruption of a man who had been giving orders for 30 years and had stopped noticing when he did it. How long have you been nursing? She paused. 22 years at this facility. Before that, have you ever been deployed? The question landed differently than he intended, or maybe exactly as he intended. Either way, she heard the subtext clearly. Are you someone who will understand what I've been through, or are you someone I'll have to translate everything for? She held his gaze. I understand the question. Let's start with your current symptoms, and we'll go from there. That's not an answer. No, she agreed. It's not. He stared at her for a moment. The flat, measuring look of a man accustomed to people backing down when he applied pressure. She didn't apply counter-pressure. She didn't look away. She just waited, pen over clipboard, like she had all morning and was perfectly content to spend it standing here. He shifted on the gurney, and the movement clearly cost him something. He covered it quickly, but she caught the tightening around his eyes. Fine, he said. 3 weeks of pain, right upper quadrant, gets worse at night. Started after I did a week of 12-mile rucks. I figured I'd pulled something. And before these 3 weeks, any previous pain in that area? Intermittently, goes back to a combat injury. 2009, Kandahar. Fragmentation wound to the right side. They got most of it out, but the surgery notes say a small fragment was left near the liver, too close to the hepatic structures to remove safely at the time. She was writing as he talked. Not taking dictation, actually writing, which was different. Processing. Has that fragment caused issues before? Once, 2015, resolved on its own. And you've had imaging done since then? Routine CT in 2019. Fragment was stable. 7 years ago, she said, not accusingly. Just noting it. He didn't answer that. She finished her notes and looked up. I'm going to order an emergency CT with contrast, and I want to get blood work done immediately. Your enzyme levels are elevated, which could indicate the fragment has shifted and is causing irritation to surrounding tissue. That's not something we can assess clinically. We need imaging. I know what elevated liver enzymes mean. Then you know we need to move quickly. She was already stepping toward the door to flag the transport team. It was at that moment that Corporal Falk, who had been standing near the bay entrance with the quiet watchfulness of someone trying to be invisible, exhaled what sounded like genuine relief. Voss caught it. He looked from Falk to Olivia Marsh's retreating back, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite a feeling, more like the first distant suggestion of one. The CT results came back 40 minutes later. Olivia was standing at the imaging station with Dr. Terrence Halbrook, the attending physician on her wing, when the radiology tech pulled up the scan. Halbrook was thorough, careful, and a good doctor in most situations. He was also 36 years old and had done his residency in suburban Atlanta, and when the scan populated on the screen, he was quiet for a moment too long. The fragment had moved. It had been sitting in the same position for 7 years, and in the past 3 weeks, likely accelerated by the physical stress Voss had put his body through, it had migrated roughly 4 millimeters toward the right hepatic artery. 4 millimeters didn't sound like much. In this context, it was significant. Okay, Halbrook said carefully. So we're looking at imminent arterial involvement, Olivia said. If this continues, we're looking at potential arterial erosion and internal bleeding. Halbrook looked at her, then back at the screen. I agree. We need to get vascular surgery involved immediately. I've already paged Dr. Renata Osei. She's in the building. He nodded, still looking at the scan. This came on faster than the triage note suggested. He's been minimizing it for 3 weeks, Olivia said. Military presentation. They tend to describe pain as less severe than it is and functional as less impaired than it is. The ruck marches he mentioned probably accelerated the migration significantly. Halbrook was quiet for a moment. Then, you sound like you've dealt with this presentation before. She was already moving. Go brief him. I'll get the room prepped. She went to tell Voss herself. He didn't take it well. Not badly in the way civilians usually took bad medical news, not with panic, not with tears. He went still in the way that soldiers sometimes do when something shifts from manageable to serious, a particular quality of internal recalibration that looks like calm from the outside. "What's the timeline, Tet?" he asked. "Uncertain. The vascular surgeon is reviewing the imaging now. Best case, we manage this conservatively and buy time for a planned surgical intervention. Worst case, the artery is compromised and we're dealing with a bleed." "What does that mean for my command schedule? I have a battalion readiness evaluation in 9 days. She looked at him, just looked at him, without judgment, without impatience, just the look of someone holding something complicated. "Colonel, I need you to set that aside for right now." I understand," she said, and she did, genuinely, which maybe was why he heard something in it that he hadn't expected. "But the readiness evaluation needs to be your last priority for the next 48 hours. Not because of protocol, because your artery is involved, and if we're wrong about the timeline, there is no coming back from that. There's no rescheduling." He stared at the ceiling. Something worked in his jaw. "Fine," he said finally. "Do what you have to do." "Thank you," she said, and left. Corporal Falk was waiting outside room 14 when Olivia came out. She looked maybe 24, Falk did, with the posture of someone who had been trained out of slouching and the eyes of someone who had been quietly watching everything for a long time. "Is he going to be okay?" she asked. "We're doing everything we can to make sure of it." Olivia met her eyes. "He's in good hands." "He doesn't think so," Falk said, not unkindly. "He asked me to call someone, a medical officer he knows at Bethesda." Olivia's expression didn't change. "He's welcome to seek a second opinion. That's his right. But it needs to happen after we've stabilized the immediate situation." Falk nodded slowly. He's not trying to be difficult. He just doesn't trust civilian medical staff," Olivia finished. "I know." She said it without bitterness. "It's not unusual for patients with long military careers. They've experienced combat medicine under conditions that are very different from what we do here, and that creates a set of expectations." "He was in for over 3 decades, Falk said. "Kandahar, Fallujah, 3 tours in." She stopped herself. "Sorry, that's probably classified." "It's fine." Olivia paused. "Fallujah?" Falk looked at her, uncertain about the shift in her voice. 2006 and 2009, from what I know." Olivia held that for a second. Then she said, "Make sure he drinks the water we left him. The dehydration isn't helping his numbers." She walked back toward the nursing station, and Falk watched her go, not entirely sure what had just passed between them. By mid-afternoon, the situation had stayed stable, barely, and in the way that stable sometimes means not yet deteriorating, rather than improving. Dr. Osei had reviewed the imaging and agreed on the conservative approach: close monitoring, activity restriction, pain management, repeat imaging in 6 hours. Voss was, by most patient standards, a terrible patient. He had his phone. He had his aide coming in and out. He had, at one point, Olivia walking past his room to find him sitting up in bed with a stack of papers that had clearly come from a courier that Falk had arranged. She went in. "Those need to go," she said. "I know what they are," she said, which surprised him. "And I understand why you feel like you need to deal with them. But you are sitting upright, which elevates your abdominal pressure, and the papers in your lap are causing you to lean forward, which means your right side is engaged. I need those gone, and I need you lying at 30 degrees. He looked at her. "How do you know about abdominal pressure and fragmentation wounds?" "I'm a senior trauma nurse in a facility that serves a large active duty population," she said evenly. "I've managed more than a few combat injuries. Please hand me the papers." He handed them over. Not easily. She could see him make the decision in real time, the slight tension in his jaw that meant he was overriding an instinct. But he handed them over. "You can have them back when Dr. Osei clears it," Olivia said. "And when will that be?" "After the 6-hour imaging, probably late evening." He was quiet for a moment. Then, and she'd learn later this was rare for him, "Thank you." She nodded and left. In the hallway, out of sight, she leaned against the wall for exactly 3 seconds and let herself breathe. The 6-hour imaging showed the fragment had moved again. Not dramatically, 0.5 millimeter, maybe less. But it had moved, which meant the conservative approach was failing, and everyone in the room reviewing the scan knew it. Osei called Halbrook. Halbrook called the surgical coordinator. Someone paged the anesthesiologist. Olivia was at the nursing station when Wesley Drum appeared at her elbow. "They're going to push for surgery tonight," he said quietly. "Ose wants to go in before the artery is fully compromised." "That's the right call. They need you in there for the pre-surgical setup. Ose requested you specifically." She didn't ask why. She already knew. She'd been in Ose's OR before, twice, in situations that required a specific kind of steadiness that not everyone had. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She went to room 14 first. Voss was lying at 30 degrees where she'd left him. The papers were gone. He had his eyes closed, not sleeping. She could tell by the quality of the stillness. Thinking. "Dr. Ose is going to come speak with you in a few minutes," she said. "She's recommending surgery tonight." He opened his eyes. "I figured. I wanted you to hear it from me first." Something crossed his face quickly. Not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Why?" She considered. "Because you've been managing this information alone all day, and you shouldn't have to hear a significant update from someone you've never met." He stared at her. "You've been watching out for me." She didn't answer that directly. "The surgical team here is excellent. Dr. Ose did 3 years of trauma surgery support attached to military medical units overseas. She knows this kind of injury." That got his attention. She could see it. "Which units?" "You'd have to ask her." He was quiet. Then, "Are you going to be in there?" "In the OR?" "Yes, I'll be part of the surgical setup team." He looked at the ceiling again. "Good," he said, and the word came out more like a decision than a compliment. She left before he could say anything else. Surgery was scheduled for 2100. At 1847, Marcus Voss's blood pressure dropped. Not gradually, the way blood pressure sometimes drops when the body is giving a measured warning. It dropped the way it drops when something has already happened, when the situation has moved from imminent risk to active crisis before anyone was ready for it. The monitor alarm went off, and by the time the first nurse reached the room, Voss was gray. His skin had taken on that particular ashen quality that anyone who has worked in emergency medicine recognizes from across a room. Not the paleness of fear or pain, but the paleness of the body pulling resources back toward its core. The clinical surrender of the surface to save the center. Olivia was in the hallway when the alarm triggered. She was at the door of room 14 in 4 seconds. She saw the numbers. She saw his color. She reached the bedside and put 2 fingers against his neck, counting, and the pulse she found was rapid and thready in the specific way that happens when volume drops fast. "Call a code," she said to the nurse behind her. "Get Ose on the line. Get me a pressure cuff and an IV kit. We need a large bore line right now." The room filled in the next 90 seconds. The code team arrived, Dr. Halbrook arrived, a resident named Simon Pratt skidded in looking like he'd been running. There was the particular controlled chaos of a medical emergency. Everyone moving, everyone with a task. The noise of equipment and voices that sounds like disorder from the outside, but has its own logic from the inside. In the middle of it, Olivia worked. She had the large bore IV line in before the code cart was fully positioned. Left antecubital, clean stick, no hesitation. She had the fluid running in the time it took Halbrook to get across the room. She was already calling out numbers, tracking the pressure, mentally building the picture of what was happening inside this man's body. "He's bleeding," she said clearly. "The fragment's gone through." Halbrook was checking the monitor. "BP is 64/40. We need to get him up to OR now. He's not going to hold." "Osei's not..." "She's on her way." Olivia looked at Voss. His eyes were open, which was something. They were unfocused, glassy, but open. "Colonel, stay with me. You hear me?" Something in his face shifted. He found her. He looked directly at her, and even with his blood pressure in the basement and his body doing everything it could to keep him alive, some basic functioning part of him registered. This person. "Marsh," he said, barely audible. "I'm here," she said. "We're moving you up. You're going to be fine." It wasn't a promise she had the authority to make. She made it anyway. His hand moved, not quite a reach, but close to one, and she put her hand over his wrist, a brief, firm press. Professional. Grounding. "Let's move," she said to the room. They moved. The gurney came through the door at speed, and Olivia moved with it, one hand on the IV line, the other on the monitor, her mind already 3 steps ahead. She could hear Halbrook on the phone behind her, calling the OR, calling Osei, calling the blood bank. In the elevator, with the doors closing, Voss turned his head toward her. His breathing was shallow and rapid and wrong. "You weren't just—" he started. "Don't talk," she said, not harshly. "Save it." He closed his eyes. The elevator moved upward, and Olivia counted his breaths, and somewhere in the closed space of that metal box, rising toward the surgical floor, the truth of who she was had already begun to surface, not yet visible to him, not yet visible to the people who would spend the next several hours trying to understand what they had missed, but there, present, unavoidable. The way things that have been buried for a long time sometimes begin to push toward the light before anyone realizes the ground has shifted. The doors opened. They ran. The OR doors swung open, and the gurney hit the surgical floor at speed, wheels screaming against the linoleum, and Olivia didn't let go of the IV line until the transfer team had Voss onto the table and the anesthesiologist had both hands on him. Dr. Renata Osei was already gowned when they came through. She was a compact woman, early 40s, with the focused stillness of someone who had done this enough times that urgency no longer expressed itself as visible panic. It expressed itself as precision. She took one look at Voss on the table, one look at the monitor, and then looked at Olivia. "Tell me," she said. BP dropped at 1847. 64/40 on arrival upstairs. We pushed 2 liters of saline in transit. He's at 71 now, but it's not holding. Based on the imaging pattern and the rate of drop, I'd estimate the fragment's gone through the posterior wall of the right hepatic artery. Osei was moving as she listened. "You're guessing on that?" "Yes." "Good guess," Osei said, because she'd pulled up the imaging on the room's secondary monitor and the trajectory confirmed it. "Get me a scrub tech. Where's my second?" "Dr. Pratt is scrubbing in," someone said. Osei looked at Pratt, who was still the color of a man who had been running. "You good?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then let's go." Olivia moved to the periphery of the room. Her role in the OR was support, not surgical, and she knew her position without being told. She monitored the secondary panel, tracked fluid intake, watched the anesthesiologist's adjustments with the particular attention of someone who understood what each number meant in context. What she did not do was leave. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes. At 01:43, Dr. Osei walked out of the OR with her mask pulled down around her chin and found Corporal Falk still in the waiting area, sitting bolt upright in a chair with her hands clasped in her lap, not sleeping, not reading, just waiting with the focused endurance of someone trained to hold a position indefinitely. "He's out of surgery," Osei said. "He's stable. The artery was compromised, but we were able to repair it. He's going to recover." Falk's composure held for about 3 seconds. Then something in her jaw moved, and she pressed her lips together, and she said very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am." "Don't thank me," Osei said. "Thank whoever got him up here when they did. Another 20 minutes, and we'd have been having a different conversation." She didn't say who that was. She didn't need to. Falk had been watching long enough to know. Voss woke up in the ICU at 06:30 with the particular disorientation of someone surfacing from anesthesia. The ceiling too bright, the sounds arriving before the meanings, the body present, but not yet fully reported. He lay still and let the information come in gradually, the way he'd learned to do in field hospitals, where waking up too fast had sometimes meant reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. He was alive. He processed that first. He was in a hospital room. Second, he was in pain, which was tolerable, because tolerable pain meant the surgery had worked and they'd managed the dosing correctly. Third, he moved his eyes to the right without turning his head, the inventory habit of 30-plus years. Medical equipment, IV lines. A window with indirect morning light. A chair beside the bed, empty. He moved his eyes left. Olivia Marsh was at the nursing station, visible through the glass partition, writing something, her back partly turned to him. She hadn't noticed he was awake. He watched her for a moment. This woman he'd dismissed in 45 seconds the previous morning, based on a set of assumptions he was now, in the quiet clarity of someone who had come close to dying, revising. She had called the code. That much had come through the fog before the elevator. She had seen what was happening, and she had moved on it without waiting for a physician to tell her what she already knew. She had gotten the line in fast. She had kept him talking, She had run with the gurney. She had been in the OR. He didn't know what she'd done in the OR. He'd been unconscious for that part. But he had spent 30 years reading people, and he had learned that the way someone moves in a crisis tells you more about their history than anything they could say about themselves. And the way Olivia Marsh had moved last night had not been the movement of someone who had only ever worked in clean hospital corridors. He was still working on that problem when she turned and saw him through the glass. She came in without hurrying. "Good morning," she said. "How's your pain?" "Manageable." "On a scale?" "4," he said. "Maybe 5." She noted it, checked his lines, checked the monitor, did the brief, efficient inventory of someone who could assess a patient's status in under 60 seconds. Her hands were sure. They had always been sure. He remembered that from yesterday, from the IV line in the emergency, from the way she'd pressed her fingers against his wrist to ground him as the elevator moved upward. "Dr. Osei will be in this morning," Olivia said. "The surgery went well, the artery is repaired. You'll be here for observation for several days, and then we'll talk about a graduated recovery plan." "How long until I'm back to full function?" She looked at him, and there was something in it. Not quite patience, not quite something else. "That depends on how you approach recovery, which, based on the last 24 hours, I think we both know is going to be the harder part of this process for you." He almost smiled. Didn't quite get there, but came closer than he had in some time. "You're not wrong," he said. She finished her notes. Was turning to go. "Marsh." She stopped. "Last night, what you did before the elevator. You called the code before Halbrook got there." She didn't answer right away. "You saw the numbers and you already knew," he said. "You knew before anyone else in that room." "The numbers were clear." "That's not what I'm saying." She turned back to look at him. There was a stillness in her that he recognized now from a different angle. Not the stillness of someone waiting to be dismissed, but the stillness of someone who has spent a long time deciding how much of themselves to show in any given room. "Get some rest," she said. "We'll talk more when you're stronger." She left. He watched her go and thought, there is something I don't know about this woman, and I think she knows that I know that. The next 36 hours passed in the irregular rhythm of ICU time, which is its own particular clock. Vitals checks and medication rounds and the low-grade noise of a ward that never fully sleeps. Voss was a poor patient in the ways Olivia had already anticipated. He kept trying to sit up further than he was supposed to. He had Falk bring him briefing materials on the second day, and he asked questions about his own chart with the specificity of someone who had read the clinical notes and was working out the implications. He did not, notably, ask again for a different nurse. On the afternoon of the second day, she was reviewing his fluid balance when he said, without preamble, "The medic who kept the 3rd Expeditionary's advance team alive in the Korengal, 2008. You ever hear that name?" Olivia kept writing. "Her name was different back then," she said. "Different unit, different rank, different life." He was very still. "That was you," he said. She didn't answer immediately. She finished writing the number she was writing, because the number mattered, and she didn't lose her place for anything, and then she set the pen down and looked at him. "The 3rd Expeditionary's advance team was a different unit than the one in the Korengal story you're thinking of," she said. "But if you're asking whether I spent time in Afghanistan in combat medical support roles, yes." "Which unit?" She held his gaze. "I served with 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion for most of my deployment years. Before that, Fleet Marine Force Medical with the 1st Marines." Voss went quiet. Not the quiet of a man without a response. The quiet of a man recalibrating something significant. The 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion. He knew that unit. He had coordinated with elements of that unit 3 separate times in theater. He knew what their combat medics went through. He knew what the casualty rates looked like on extended operations. And he knew what it meant to be a medical specialist embedded with raiders in active contact. "How long?" he asked. 2 deployments. 8 years in uniform, total. I got out in 2005. "Why?" The question came out more directly than he probably intended. She didn't seem to mind it. "My daughter was 4, she said. Her father had been out for 2 years already. There was a point where the math stopped working." He nodded slowly. That was an answer he understood. The specific arithmetic of a military life weighed against a life outside it. The calculation that everyone who has spent significant time in uniform eventually faces. And you went into nursing, he said. I'd been doing field medicine for 8 years. Civilian nursing was a lateral move in a lot of ways. Different context, same fundamentals. You could have gone to medical school. She looked at him with something that was almost but not quite amusement. I was 31 with a 4-year-old and a mortgage. Medical school wasn't the practical choice. Practical, he repeated, like the word had a taste he was testing. It has served me fine, she said simply. He was quiet again. Then, when I said what I said in the intake bay, it's all right. I'm not saying it to apologize, he said, and it came out a little rough, the honesty of a man who was not practiced at this. I'm saying that I was wrong about what I was seeing, and I want you to know I understand that. She picked up her pen. I've heard worse, and I've been dismissed by people with more reason to know better. She said it without any particular weight, just a fact, stated clearly. The important thing is that you're alive and recovering. That's what I came here to do. She left him with that, and he lay in the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about it for a long time. What? The ward gossip about Olivia Marsh, as it turned out, had layers. Crestview Military Medical Center was a facility that served a large active duty population, which meant its staff included a not insignificant number of veterans, people who had come out of the service and slid sideways into civilian medicine through various routes. The nursing staff was particularly dense with them. It created a particular kind of institutional culture, one in which a certain baseline of shared experience existed, even when it wasn't talked about openly. People knew things about Olivia Marsh in the way that people in closed communities know things, not through direct conversation, but through accumulation. The way she moved in crisis situations, the way she seemed to read a patient's deterioration before the monitors caught up, the specific vocabulary she used when she was under pressure, which was not the vocabulary of civilian medical training. What most of them did not know was the specifics, the unit, the years, the deployment conditions. She didn't volunteer it, and she didn't display it. There was no framed citation on her locker, no challenge coin on her keyring, no moment where she referenced it to establish credibility in an argument. She just worked, and the work was what it was, and if you were paying attention, you could see it. Wesley Drum had been paying attention for 6 years. He'd known since her 3rd month at the facility that she was former military. He hadn't known the details until the day he'd happened to see the tattoo. It was a moment of pure accident. She'd been rolling up her sleeve to change into scrubs, and he'd been in the hallway, and the positioning had been such that he'd seen it for maybe 3 seconds before she'd pulled the fabric down. But 3 seconds was enough. A Marine Corps emblem, small and precise, placed just below the interior of her left elbow. Beside it, a combat medical insignia, and beside that, something he'd had to look up afterward. The unit designation of 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion, rendered in a style that predated the current redesign, which meant she'd had it done during her service years. He'd never said anything to her about it. It didn't seem like his place. But on the morning of Voss's 3rd day in recovery, Wesley was at the nursing station when Dr. Halbrook appeared with a particular expression on his face. The expression of a man who had been in an uncomfortable meeting and was still processing it. The administrative office wants to speak with Olivia, Halbrook said quietly. Wesley looked up. About what? About the code response on the Voss admission. Halbrook lowered his voice further. Apparently the documentation shows she called the code before a physician was present and made independent clinical judgments about the patient's status. Wesley was quiet for a moment. She also saved his life, he said. I know that, Halbrook said, and he did, genuinely. It was in his voice. But people are looking at the documentation and asking questions about her scope of practice, whether some of what she did constituted independent medical decision-making beyond the nursing role. Who is people? Dr. Gareth Blum, the deputy medical director. Wesley set down his pen. He knew Gareth Blum. Blum had been at Crestview for 9 years, had never deployed anywhere, had never done anything close to emergency field medicine, and held a particular and well-documented view that the appropriate hierarchy of medical decision-making should flow downward from physicians and not be interrupted by nursing staff exercising independent clinical judgment, regardless of outcome. He's going to file a complaint, Wesley said. He's already filed it. Halbrook looked genuinely unhappy. I want you to know, I've submitted a supporting account. I'm not, I'm not going to let this stand without pushing back. Does she know? I'm going to tell her this morning. How do you think she'll take it? Halbrook thought about that for a moment. He had known Olivia Marsh for 4 years, and in those 4 years he had watched her navigate every kind of difficult situation a hospital floor could produce with the same quality of contained, undemonstrative competence. He had never once seen her panic, never once seen her flinch from something that needed to be done, and never once, not a single time, seen her invoke her own history or experience as a defense against anything. I think, he said carefully, she'll take it the same way she takes everything. He was right. Olivia listened to him explain the situation in its entirety. She was standing with her arms crossed, not defensively, just the posture of someone holding themselves in while they processed information. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. When he finished, she said, "When is the administrative meeting?" "Tomorrow afternoon." "I'll be there." "Olivia, I want to—" "I'll be there," she said again, and her voice was completely even. "Thank you for telling me." She went back to work. Voss heard about it from Falk, who heard about it from the logistics coordinator, who had overheard 2 people at the medication station. He heard about it at 1400 on his 3rd day of recovery, and by 1415 he had asked 3 times to be sat up further than Dr. Osei had approved, and by 1430 he had sent Falk to find Halbrook. Halbrook came in at 1445 with the practiced expression of someone managing multiple fires. He closed the door behind him. "I need the documentation from my code response," Voss said. Halbrook looked at him. "Colonel, I was the patient. I have a right to that documentation. I need everything from the point of my blood pressure drop through OR transfer. Every action, who called it, who initiated it, timestamp on the IV line. I understand, but I'm not asking you to do anything that violates anyone's privacy. I'm asking for my own medical records, which I am legally entitled to." Voss's voice was measured and flat in the specific way of a man who was not going to be moved by any form of deflection. "I'm also going to need to make a phone call. Colonel, the administrative process, doctor." He looked at Halbrook directly. "A woman who kept me alive is being investigated for keeping me alive. I'm going to need my records and a phone." Halbrook left the room and found Wesley at the nursing station and said very quietly, "I think we need to prepare for this to become significantly more complicated." Wesley looked through the glass partition at the room where Voss was already dictating something to Falk and thought that complicated was one word for what was coming. What came was not complicated. What came, when it came, was going to be a great deal louder than complicated. But before it came, before the meeting, before the documentation, before the phone call that Voss made at 1600 to a number he kept memorized because he didn't write down the contact information of people he trusted with things that mattered, something else happened that changed the entire shape of the story. Olivia was on her evening rounds when she came to room 14 and found it empty. Not empty in the sense of discharged, empty in the sense of gurney. Repositioned and blanket pushed aside, and one set of IV lines carefully disconnected from the stand, the tubing arranged in a way that could only mean someone had done it deliberately, by hand, with some knowledge of how the lines worked. She stood in the doorway for a full 3 seconds. Then she heard the sound from down the hall. A sharp, involuntary sound, the kind the body makes when pain overrides whatever the mind was trying to do. And she was already moving before she fully registered what it meant. She found him in the corridor outside the fire stairwell. He had made it approximately 15 feet from his room. He was upright, barely, one hand against the wall, the other pressed to his surgical site, and his color had gone bad in the rapid, specific way she had seen twice before in men who had torn fresh surgical repairs. "Colonel," she said, and her voice was controlled in the way that you get controlled fast when the alternative is losing precious seconds. "I needed—" he started. "No," she said. "Don't talk. Lean into me." He didn't argue. She got an arm around him, took his weight, more than she'd expected, all of it, and began moving him back toward the room. I was working hard to stay upright and mostly managing it, which told her the damage was not yet catastrophic, but the sweat on his face and the way his breathing had shortened told her they had a narrow window. "What were you doing?" she said, walking, keeping her voice level. "Falk's shift ended," he said through his teeth. "I needed to get to the charge nurse. The documentation meeting is tomorrow, and I need—" "You needed to call," she said, You needed to press the call button and let someone bring you a phone. You didn't think that would work fast enough, she said. I know. They were at the door of his room. I've met you. I know exactly how you think. She got him back onto the bed. He was breathing hard, not the labored breathing of a failing man, but the breathing of someone who had put serious effort into something they shouldn't have attempted. She checked his surgical site through the gown, checked his lines, checked his color. Nothing's torn, she said, though she was going to need imaging to be certain. But you came close. She looked at him directly. If you had made it to that stairwell, I wasn't going to the stairwell. If you had, he met her eyes. There was something there, frustration, but beneath it, something she recognized from the elevator, from the moment he'd reached her name through the haze of a blood pressure in the basement. I was trying, he said, to do something useful. She held his gaze for a moment, then she sat down in the chair beside his bed, not because she needed to sit, but because she needed him to stop treating this like a position he could charge out of if the angle changed. Tell me what you need, she said. Tell me specifically what you need and I will make sure it happens. But you don't leave this room again without telling me first. He looked at her. This woman who had rolled him back from the corridor on the weight of her own arms and hadn't once raised her voice. The documentation, he said, from the code response. I need it by morning. I'll get it. And I need to know what she did, specifically. What you did, step by step, from the moment you walked into my room. Because tomorrow, they're going to try to call it a violation, and I need to know exactly what happened so I can... He stopped, so he could defend her. She was quiet for a moment. You're going to go to that meeting, she said. It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. Someone has to. She looked at him. This man who had dismissed her in 45 seconds, and then spent the last 3 days quietly revising everything, the same way he'd handed over the papers when she'd asked, because some part of him that was not the rank or the posture or the long habit of command understood that she was right. I'll get you the documentation, she said, and you'll let me... I'm not going to stop you from doing what you think you need to do, she said, but I'm also not... She stopped herself, started again. This has happened to me before, people trying to manage consequences on my behalf. It usually creates more problems than it solves. This is different. You say that. I've reviewed about 6 versions of this situation in 30 years, he said quietly, and yes, this is different. She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he held it, didn't look away, let her read whatever she was reading. Get some sleep, she said finally. I'll have the documentation ready by Yo 600. She stood, was at the door. Marsh. She turned. That tattoo, he said. The one you're covering, second Marsoc. That's not a unit people outside a specific community would know to recognize. She said nothing. Someone on my staff, he said, recognized it before all of this. They mentioned it to me after the surgery. He paused. They said you rolled your sleeve in the OR when you were working. Olivia's expression didn't change, but something in the room changed anyway. A shift in pressure, a stillness that had a different quality than the stillness that had been there a moment before. Who on your staff, she said carefully, was in that OR? That's the question, isn't it? He said. Not a challenge, just a man laying out what he knew. Because if someone saw it and told someone else who told someone else, that's a chain of information that may already be moving in a direction you can't stop. She stood in the doorway. Outside, the ward was quiet in the way hospitals are quiet late at night. Not silence, but a reduced frequency, the sound of a building in a lower register. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped twice and stopped. A cart moved past, wheels on linoleum. Olivia Marsh stood in the doorway of room 14 and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent decades being underestimated, that whatever she had managed to keep private about herself for the past 19 years was no longer entirely hers to manage. The question was only what someone was going to do with it, and whether they would get to her history before she got to the meeting. She walked back to the nursing station and stood there for a moment with her hands flat on the counter, not moving, just breathing. 19 years. She had managed 19 years of keeping that part of her life in a separate compartment, not hidden exactly, because the tattoo was always there, and the knowledge was always there, and the way her hands moved in a crisis was always there, but contained. She had made a decision when she left the service that she was going to be a nurse, fully and without footnote, and that the other thing was going to stay in its box because it served no one to carry it forward into a civilian ward where it would become either a party trick or a liability. Now, someone had seen the tattoo in the OR. Someone had connected it to a name. And that name was moving through a chain of people she couldn't track, in a direction she couldn't control, toward a meeting tomorrow afternoon where the wrong kind of attention was already pointed directly at her. She pulled out the ward log and started documenting the corridor incident, Voss's unauthorized attempt to leave his room, her intervention, his current status. She wrote it factually, clinically, with no editorializing. She had been doing this long enough to know that documentation was its own form of defense, and she wasn't going to give anyone a gap to work with. Wesley found her at 22:30. He came around the corner of the station with 2 coffees, set one beside her without asking, and stood there in the way that meant he had something to say and was deciding how to say it. "Just say it," she said without looking up. "Blum pulled your personnel file this afternoon." She kept writing. "He's allowed to." He pulled it before he filed the complaint, which means the complaint isn't actually about the code response. The code response is the mechanism. The complaint is about something else. She set her pen down. "What did he find?" "I don't know what's in your file, but I know Blum, and I know he doesn't move unless he thinks he has something he can use." Wesley wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "He's been wanting to restructure the senior nursing roles for 2 years. There's a budget argument for it, and the board has been resistant because the patient outcome metrics don't support it. But if he can get a senior nurse dismissed for cause, it changes the argument," she said. "It changes the argument." She was quiet for a moment, then she picked up her pen and kept writing, because the documentation still needed to be done, and standing here talking about Gareth Blum wasn't going to finish it. "The meeting is at 1400 tomorrow," she said. "I know. I'll be there." "Olivia." He waited until she looked at him. "You should bring someone, a union rep at minimum. Halbrook has already said he'll speak, but you need someone in your corner who isn't just a colleague." She looked at him for a moment. "I'll think about it." She didn't think about it. She finished the documentation, did her final round check, confirmed Voss was stable and sleeping, actually sleeping, which she noted with something close to relief, and left the building at 0115 with the documentation package Wesley had pulled from records tucked under her arm. She drove home, made tea she didn't drink, and sat at her kitchen table for an hour going through the papers. Every action she'd taken from the moment Voss's monitor alarmed. Every decision point, the IV line, the code call, the fluid push, the OR presence. She read it the way she imagined Blum would read it, looking for the seams, the moments where civilian nursing scope ended and something else began. She found 3, maybe 4, depending on how you defined independent clinical judgment versus nursing assessment. The distinction was genuinely blurry in emergency situations, which was usually fine, because in emergency situations, outcomes trumped process, and nobody revisited the paperwork carefully unless something went wrong. Something hadn't gone wrong. Something had gone very right. And Gareth Blum was going to use the blurriness to argue that what she'd done constituted practicing medicine without a license. She put the papers down and looked at the wall. Her daughter had called last week. Mara, 32 now, living in Portland, working in public health. She called every Sunday. They talked for 40 minutes. It was the most reliable part of Olivia's week. Mara knew her mother was a nurse. She knew her mother had been in the military. She didn't know most of what had happened in between, and Olivia had spent 20 years deciding that was the right amount for her daughter to carry. She didn't call Mara now. She wouldn't until this was resolved one way or another. She went to bed at 02:30 and lay in the dark and thought about the 2nd MARSOC casualty station in Kunar province in the winter of 2003, which was the last time she had felt this specific quality of calm before something went seriously wrong. The morning brought 3 things in rapid succession. First, Voss's imaging came back clean. No rebleeding, no torn repair, the artery holding. Dr. Osi noted in the chart that the patient had sustained a significant physical exertion the previous evening. She phrased it neutrally, but the phrase significant physical exertion in a post-surgical chart was its own kind of editorial, and that monitoring would continue. His numbers were stable. He was, against reasonable odds, doing well. Second, Dr. Blum circulated a memo to the senior medical staff at 0800. Olivia saw it when she arrived for her shift. It was 2 paragraphs, administrative in tone, referencing an ongoing review of nursing scope documentation related to a recent emergency response, and requesting that staff not discuss the matter pending formal review. The memo was addressed to physicians and department heads, not nursing staff. Wesley put a printed copy on her station without a word. Third, Corporal Falk arrived at 0845 with a leather portfolio under her arm and the expression of someone on a specific mission. "He wants to see you," Falk said. "He's not supposed to have visitors before 10. He said to tell you that 10 is a guideline, and guidelines are not orders." Olivia looked at her for a moment. Then she pulled on fresh gloves and said, "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 8. Voss was sitting up at the approved 30 degrees, which was a form of concession she noted without comment. He had the documentation package on his lap, the one she'd left for Falk at the nursing station at 0600 as promised, and he had clearly been through it. There were notes in the margins, made in the small, dense handwriting of someone trained to annotate quickly and precisely. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "I've gone through this 3 times," he said. I've identified the points Bloom will target: the code call before physician presence, the fluid volume decision, and the OR involvement. Those are the 3 vectors. "I know," she said. "The code call is defensible under any reasonable interpretation of nursing emergency protocol. The fluid decision is grayer. You made a volume call based on clinical presentation before a physician confirmed the diagnosis. The patient was in volume shock. Waiting for physician confirmation would have— I know what it would have done," he said, and his voice was not sharp, just firm. "I'm not disagreeing with the decision. I'm telling you how it reads on paper to someone who wants it to read badly." He looked at her directly. "The OR involvement is the cleanest one. You were requested by the surgeon. That's documented. Bloom may argue the surgeon didn't have authority to request nursing staff for a procedure outside standard scope. Osei has 37 words to say about that argument." Despite everything, Olivia almost smiled. "There's something else," Voss said. He set the papers aside. "Falk made some calls this morning. To some people I trust who know how administrative investigations at joint military-civilian facilities tend to move." He paused. "Bloom has been in contact with someone on the hospital board. A woman named Renner, Patricia Renner." Olivia went still. "You know that name," Voss said. It wasn't a question. "She was on the committee that reviewed my application to the senior nursing track 4 years ago," Olivia said carefully. "There was a disagreement about my qualifications." "What kind of disagreement?" "She felt that my background, the combination of military field medicine and civilian nursing, made my clinical decision-making pattern non-standard and difficult to evaluate for promotion purposes. She voted against the promotion. She was outvoted." Olivia's voice stayed level. "I got the position." Voss was quiet. "So she's had a file on you for 4 years. "I don't know that. I know she opposed the promotion. And now she's on the phone with she had known it since the moment Wesley told her Bloom had pulled her personnel file before filing the complaint. The complaint was never about the code response. The code response was just the door they'd found unlocked." She sat with that for a moment. Not the feeling of being blindsided, because she wasn't blindsided, but the particular weight of having your worst read of a situation confirmed. "What are you going to do?" Voss asked. "Go to the meeting," she said. "That's it?" "That's the job." She looked at him steadily. "I'm going to go to the meeting, and I'm going to answer their questions accurately, and I'm going to let the documentation speak for what it says." "And when it's not enough?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then it's not enough," she said. "But I'm not going to get ahead of that." He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the elevator, like he was still catching up to something he should have seen earlier. "You're not going to fight." "I'm going to tell the truth," she said. "That's different from not fighting." She stood. "Get some rest before Osei's morning check, and don't disconnect any lines." She was at the door when he said, "I'm going to be at that meeting." "You're not cleared for—" "I'll be there in a wheelchair if I have to." His voice was quiet and completely serious. "I'm not asking your permission." She turned, looked at him. He held it. 1400, she said, and left. The meeting was scheduled in the 3rd floor administrative conference room, which was the kind of room designed to make proceedings feel official without the procedural weight of a formal hearing. Neutral carpet, a long table, chairs arranged in the particular configuration that placed the reviewing party on one side and the subject of the review on the other. Olivia had been in rooms like this before, in different buildings, in different contexts, and she had learned that the arrangement of furniture was itself a form of argument. She arrived at 1350 with her documentation folder and the union representative Wesley had arranged. A woman named Sandra Briggs, 60 years old, 22 years as a nursing union rep, with the compact, unhurried energy of someone who had sat across tables like this one many times and was not impressed by any of it. Halbrook was already there, standing near the window with his arms crossed, which was his version of visible displeasure. He nodded when Olivia came in. Bloom arrived at 1358 with Patricia Renner and a man Olivia didn't recognize, the late 40s, in a suit rather than a white coat, which meant administration rather than medicine. He carried a leather folder and set it on the table without introducing himself. "This is David Holt," Bloom said, "legal counsel for the hospital." Sandra Briggs made a small sound that was not quite a sigh. "Ms. Briggs, nursing union," she said flatly. "Glad everyone brought their materials." They sat. Bloom had printed copies of something, and he distributed them without preamble. The formal complaint, 2 pages, laying out the 3 points Voss had already identified. Code call before physician presence. Independent fluid volume decision. OR involvement outside standard nursing scope. Olivia read it once, quickly, and then set it down. Renner was watching her from across the table with the careful attention of someone who had been waiting for this. She was 63, silver-haired, with the precise posture of a woman who had spent decades in institutional leadership and knew how to use a conference room. "Thank you for being here, Ms. Marsh," Bloom began. "It's not optional," Sandra said pleasantly. Bloom ignored that. "We want to start by reviewing the sequence of events on the evening of..." The door opened. It opened the way doors open when someone is being pushed through them in a wheelchair by a corporal who is moving at a pace that makes it clear she was told to move quickly and took that instruction seriously. Voss was in the chair in his hospital gown with a blanket across his lap, an IV line still running to a portable stand that Falk was managing with her other hand, and the particular expression on his face of a man who has decided that the appropriate response to a situation is his physical presence in it. The room went completely still. Bloom stared. Renner's expression shifted through several things rapidly before settling on something controlled. Holt, the legal counsel, looked at the IV stand and then looked at Bloom. "Colonel Voss," Bloom said carefully, "this is an administrative review. You're not... This isn't..." "I'm the patient whose care is under review," Voss said. "That gives me standing to be here." He looked at Holt. "Does it not?" Holt opened his mouth, closed it, and made a note. "You should be in recovery," Renner said. "I am recovering," Voss said. "This is what it looks like." He looked at Olivia, a brief look, and then back at the table. "Continue." Bloom collected himself. "I was a man who recovered well from disruptions. 9 years in hospital administration trained you for that. As I was saying, we want to walk through the sequence of events. Ms. Marsh, can you describe your actions from the moment you responded to the patient's room that evening?" Olivia described them, clearly, sequentially, in clinical language, without editorializing. She had done this in military after-action reviews, and she did it the same way now. Just the facts, just the timeline, just the actions, and their immediate rationale. She spoke for about 4 minutes without interruption. When she finished, Bloom said, "At the point where you initiated fluid resuscitation, that was before Dr. Halbrook arrived in the room?" "Yes." "And you made that decision independently, without physician authorization?" "I assessed the patient as being in volume shock based on his blood pressure, heart rate, skin color, and diaphoresis. I initiated a fluid challenge consistent with shock management protocol while simultaneously calling the code. Dr. Halbrook arrived approximately 90 seconds later. 90 seconds during which you were making treatment decisions. 90 seconds during which I was keeping the patient alive," she said. Not defensively, just accurately. Renner spoke for the first time. "The question, Ms. Marsh, is whether those decisions fell within the defined scope of your nursing role, not whether they were effective." "With respect," Sandra Briggs said, "effectiveness is somewhat relevant when we're talking about a patient who is actively dying. The patient's outcome doesn't determine whether a protocol was followed," Renner said. "Actually," Halbrook said from near the window, and everyone looked at him because he'd been quiet long enough that his voice was unexpected. The patient's outcome is exactly the standard we use to evaluate emergency response decisions in a clinical facility. That's been our institutional framework since 2018. I can pull the specific policy document if that would be helpful. Renner's expression tightened. The policy document doesn't address independent nursing decision-making in Section 4, Paragraph 3, Halbrook said. He reached into the folder he'd brought and produced a single printed page. In emergency situations where patient deterioration is assessed as life-threatening and physician presence is not immediately available, nursing staff are authorized to initiate stabilization measures consistent with their training and clinical judgment. The key phrase is consistent with their training. He set the page on the table. Which brings us to the question of Ms. Marsh's training. Blum looked at him. Something had shifted, not in the room's formal structure, but in the weight distribution of the argument, and everyone could feel it. Her training is documented in her personnel file, Blum said. Standard nursing certification, continuing education credits. Her complete training, Halbrook said, including her prior service record. The room went quiet in a different way. Olivia looked at Halbrook. He met her eyes briefly, a look that said, "I know. I'm sorry. But this is what it takes." She looked at the table and said nothing. Ms. Marsh's personnel file contains her civilian credentials, Renner said carefully. Her prior service history is directly relevant to the question of whether her clinical decision-making in an emergency situation was within the scope of her demonstrated competence, Halbrook said, which is the question you've put on the table. So let's answer it. He produced another sheet from his folder. Olivia Marsh served 8 years in the United States Marine Corps. She holds a Fleet Marine Force Qualified Medical Officer designation, which is one of the highest clinical ratings available to military medical personnel and qualifies the holder to perform advanced trauma interventions in field conditions. She completed 2 combat deployments with 2nd Marine Special Operations Battalion as an embedded trauma specialist. Her service record includes documented performance of emergency surgical level interventions under fire. He looked at Blum directly. The fluid resuscitation call she made in Colonel Voss's room is so far within her demonstrated competency that this complaint, read against her full record, isn't a question of scope. It's a question of why someone pulled her personnel file before filing it. The silence that followed had a texture to it. Blum said, "That service record is not part of her current credentials." "It's part of who she is," Halbrook said, "and you knew that when you filed." Renner's composure was intact, but something behind it had shifted. She looked from Blum to Holt, a look that passed too quickly, but that Sandra Briggs caught, because Sandra Briggs caught everything. Voss had been still through all of this, which was a specific kind of effort given how much staying still cost him physically right now. He spoke for the first time since sitting down. "I'd like to make a statement," he said. Holt looked up from his notes. "Colonel, you're not formally—" "I'm the patient." His voice was measured and had the particular quality of finality that came from a man who had ended arguments with it for 30 years. "My care is under review. I have direct material knowledge of the events in question. I will make a statement." No one told him not to. "On the night in question," he said, "I was dying. That is not a figure of speech. My blood pressure was 64/40, my arterial repair had failed, and without immediate intervention, I would not have reached the OR. The intervention that kept me alive was initiated by Olivia Marsh before any physician was present, because she was the only person in that room who correctly assessed what was happening and moved on it without waiting for permission she didn't need." He looked at Renner, then at Blum. "I have reviewed the documentation. I have consulted with my own medical staff. And I am telling you, as the patient whose life was saved and as a senior military officer with 31 years of experience evaluating critical decision-making under pressure, what she did was not a protocol violation. It was exactly what a person with her training and experience was supposed to do. The fact that it's being characterized otherwise tells me this review is not about patient care." He stopped. "Let it sit." Holt was writing something, fast. Blum said, "Colonel, I understand your perspective, but the institutional review process is being used," Voss said, "by people who have a prior grievance against this staff member. I'm aware of the board contact. I'm aware of the promotion committee history, and I want that on the record, whatever record you're keeping here." Renner's composure, which had been holding by diminishing margins, made a sound it didn't quite reach the surface of. That is an unfounded characterization of Dr. Renner. Sandra Briggs' voice was pleasant, in the way that very sharp things are sometimes pleasant. Before this goes further, I'd like to formally request the full documentation trail for this complaint, including all communications between hospital administration and board members related to Ms. Marsh from the past 4 years. That's a standard union discovery request, and you're obligated to respond to it within 5 business days. The color in Renner's face did something complicated. Blum looked at Holt. Holt looked at his notes and wrote something else. The meeting did not end there. These things never ended cleanly, because institutions are not designed for clean endings. But something had broken in the formal architecture of the proceeding, a load-bearing piece of the structure that the complaint had depended on, and everyone in the room could feel the shift, even if no one acknowledged it aloud. Blum called a recess. He used the word recess the way people use formal language when they need time to privately reassess, which is to say, he used it as a container for something that had no better name in that moment. They filed out in separate directions, Blum and Holt toward a corner of the hallway where they spoke in voices too low to carry, Renner toward the window at the end of the corridor where she stood with her back to the room. Sandra Briggs leaned toward Olivia and said very quietly, "That went better than I expected." "It's not over," Olivia said. "No, but the tide turned in there and everyone knows it." Olivia looked toward where Voss was parked in the hallway outside the conference room, Falk standing at his elbow with her hands behind her back in the watchful posture of someone on duty. He wasn't looking at Olivia. He was looking at Blum and Holt in their corner with the particular focused attention of a man doing tactical assessment. She thought, he came here in a hospital gown with an IV line still running, and he sat in that room and said the thing that needed to be said, and he said it without grandstanding, without weaponizing his rank more than was necessary, without making it about himself. He said it because it was true, and because it was the right thing to do, and because somewhere in the past 5 days, something had shifted in the way he understood what he owed to the people around him. She hadn't expected that from him. She had been wrong about what to expect. The recess lasted 11 minutes. When they reconvened, Holt indicated that the formal proceedings would be paused pending review of the documentation Ms. Briggs had requested, and that no disciplinary action would be taken in the interim. He used the word interim with the care of a man leaving himself a door he wasn't certain he'd need to use. Blum said nothing further. Renner did not return to the table. When it was over and they were in the hallway and Falk was maneuvering Voss's chair toward the elevator, he looked back once at Olivia across the corridor. She met his eyes, nodded once, the minimal acknowledgement of two people who have been through something together and don't need to perform their awareness of it. He nodded back, and then the elevator opened, and he was gone. It took 4 more days for the formal withdrawal to come. 4 days during which Olivia continued her shifts because she was not suspended pending the outcome, and she was not going to act as if she were. She worked, she documented, she did her rounds. She checked on Voss twice daily, which was her professional obligation, and they didn't talk about the meeting directly. Not because the subject was avoided, but because there wasn't much to say that wasn't better said by waiting. Holt had done the math quickly. He'd called Blum the evening of the meeting and had a conversation that Blum later described to Renner as clarifying the legal exposure. What the discovery request would surface, if it ran its course, was a pattern of communication that had begun not 2 days before the complaint, but 14 months earlier, when Renner had first flagged Olivia's name in a budget restructuring memo as a high-cost senior staff position with non-standard credentials. The memo had never been shared with Olivia. It had never been shared with the nursing union. It had been circulating at the board level for over a year, which meant the complaint wasn't opportunistic. It was the execution of a plan that had been waiting for a mechanism. Sandra Briggs, when she saw the documentation her discovery request produced, said 2 words that Olivia would not repeat to anyone. Then she called a meeting of her own. The formal withdrawal of the complaint arrived in writing on a Thursday morning, addressed to Olivia and copied to Sandra and to the nursing department head. It was 2 sentences. It cited new information regarding the full scope of the staff member's clinical qualifications and stated that the complaint had been resolved without disciplinary action. It did not apologize. It did not acknowledge the 4 years of positioning that had preceded it. Olivia read it once, put it in her folder, and went back to work. Wesley found her 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just put a cup of coffee beside her the way he had the night everything started. And she looked at it and then looked at him, and something moved in her face that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to it. "It's not over," she said. "No," he agreed, "but today it's over." She picked up the coffee. Voss was cleared for limited mobility on day 5 and transferred out of the ICU to a standard recovery room with a window that faced the bay. He had, in the intervening days, made 3 phone calls that he had not told Olivia about, spoken twice with Dr. Osei about the longer-term implications of his injury, and argued with Falk about the battalion readiness evaluation until Falk had, with visible effort, presented him with a memo from his second-in-command indicating that the evaluation had been rescheduled and the battalion was functioning normally in his absence, at which point Voss had gone quiet and looked out the window for a while. When Olivia came in on the morning of day 6 with his vitals chart and the news about the withdrawal, he was already sitting in the chair by the window rather than in the bed, which was technically within the approved mobility parameters and technically also pushing against them. She told him about the withdrawal the same way she told patients about their labs, directly, factually, without performance. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens to Blum?" "That's under separate review now. Sandra's team found enough in the discovery documentation to file an independent complaint about the prior communications." "And Renner?" "Same process. The board is convening a review of the budget memo and the pattern of contact with Blum." She paused. "These things take time." "They shouldn't," he said. "No," she agreed. "But they do." He looked out the window. The bay was flat and gray this morning, a low sky, the kind of morning that suggested weather without committing to it. "You're not satisfied," he said. She looked at him. "I'm relieved," she said carefully. "The complaint is withdrawn. My record is clear. That matters. But the thing that generated the complaint is still there. Renner is still on the board. Bloom is still the deputy medical director. The budget memo is still something someone wrote and circulated for 14 months without my knowledge." She stopped. "I've been in institutions long enough to know that withdrawal doesn't mean the conditions that produce the problem have changed. It means this particular version of it didn't work." He was watching her with the focused quality of a man who spent his life reading situations and had gotten very good at it. "What does it mean for you? Not institutionally. For you." She thought about that for a moment, the kind of question she didn't often get in the specific form of being asked to separate what was professional from what was personal, as if those were 2 distinct things in a life that had never organized itself that way. "I'm tired," she said, simply, without apology. "I've been doing this for 22 years and I'm good at it, and I want to keep doing it, and I'm tired of the part where being good at it is held against me because it doesn't fit the shape people expected." He nodded. Not in sympathy exactly, more in recognition. "I know that feeling," he said. She believed him. The board's internal review was announced 11 days after the complaint withdrawal, which was faster than these things usually moved. A sign, Sandra told her, that someone at the board level had looked at the discovery documentation and understood immediately what it meant for institutional liability. Olivia was not in the meeting where the announcement was made. She was in the middle of a wound assessment when her phone buzzed, and she read Sandra's message on her break, standing in the break room with a half-eaten sandwich. Full review opened. Both Bloom and Renner under formal inquiry. Access to personnel files restricted pending investigation. This is the one. She finished the sandwich and went back to her patient. That evening, leaving the building at the end of her shift, she stopped on the sidewalk outside and stood there for a moment in the specific quality of late afternoon light that happens in early spring, air still with winter in it, light already reaching further than it had a month before. She thought about things she didn't let herself think about during work hours. The 2003 casualty station in Kunar province. Her daughter at 4 years old standing in the driveway when Olivia came home for the last time in uniform, the way Mara had looked at her. Not knowing what the uniform meant, not knowing what was being set aside, just knowing her mother was home. 22 years of shifts and charts and decisions made in the narrow space between what the protocol said and what the patient needed. A Marine colonel pointing at her in an intake bay and telling her she didn't belong there. Standing in room 14 2 hours later, watching his blood pressure crater, and moving anyway. She pushed off the wall and walked to her car. On the 14th day, Dr. Gareth Bloom submitted his resignation. He submitted it in writing to the board chair, in a letter that cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other professional opportunities. The letter did not mention the inquiry. It did not mention the discovery documentation. It did not mention Olivia Marsh or the complaint he'd filed, or the 14 months of budget memos that had preceded it. It was a clean exit attempted by a man who had calculated that a clean exit was better than the alternative, and it would have worked as a clean exit if Sandra Briggs hadn't already submitted the independent complaint to the state medical board 3 days earlier. That complaint was not going away with a resignation letter. That complaint had its own timeline, its own investigators, and its own set of documentation that did not depend on Bloom's continued employment at Crestview to proceed. Sandra had made sure of that. Sandra had been doing this for 22 years, and she understood exactly how people like Bloom tried to manage their exposure. And she had made the state board submission precisely because she knew the resignation was coming. Renner did not resign. But 3 days after Bloom's letter, she was formally removed from the Nursing Oversight Committee, the specific committee that held supervisory authority over senior nursing staff evaluations and promotions. The board cited a conflict of interest related to the ongoing inquiry. The phrasing was careful and institutional, the language of organizations protecting themselves, but the outcome was concrete. The person who had spent 4 years maneuvering against Olivia from a position of oversight authority no longer held that position. Wesley put the memo on Olivia's station at 0800. She read it and put it in the folder with the complaint withdrawal. Halbrook found her at mid-morning. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping enough, which was accurate, but also like a man who had something he wanted to say and was working out how. "You know you could have fought harder," he said, publicly. "There were people who would have—" "I know," she said. "You chose not to." "I chose to let the documentation do it," she said. "It's cleaner." He was quiet for a moment. "It's also lonelier," he said. She looked at him because it was such an unexpected thing for Halbrook to say. He was not a man who spoke easily about what things felt like, that she didn't have an immediate answer. "Yes," she said, after a moment. "It is." He nodded, like that was something he'd needed to hear confirmed. Then, "Voss is being discharged tomorrow." "I know. I'm doing his final pre-discharge assessment this afternoon. He asked about you. Every time I've been in there, he's asked." She pulled on her gloves. "He worries," she said. "It's how he's built." Halbrook almost smiled. "Is that all it is?" She didn't answer that. She walked toward the ward. The pre-discharge assessment took 25 minutes. Voss was dressed, actual clothes, the first time she'd seen him in anything other than a hospital gown, which had the slightly disorienting quality of all such moments, and sitting in the chair by his window with his posture mostly restored, which told her the pain was being managed and his body was finding its way back to itself. She went through the assessment methodically. He answered without deflecting, which was a change from the first day, and she noted it without remarking on it. When she finished, she wrote the final notes in his chart, signed off on the discharge documentation, and handed him the printed recovery instructions. "Osei has the follow-up schedule," she said. 6 weeks minimum before any significant physical activity. The RUC schedule waits until 3-month imaging confirms the repair is holding. "I've been briefed," he said. "I'm rebriefing you because in my clinical experience, patients with your behavioral pattern hear the initial briefing as a suggestion." He looked at her. "Fair." She closed the folder. "Falk is coming at 11 tomorrow," he said. "I know." She already coordinated with the discharge team. "Marsh," she looked at him. "The formal recognition I mentioned," he said. "I've been in contact with the battalion and with some people at the base. There's going to be an event." He said it carefully, the way he said everything that mattered, not as a performance, just as information that was also something more. "It's not going to be small." She looked at him steadily. "What does that mean, specifically?" "It means there are people who know your name from before you were a nurse," he said. "People who've been in rooms where that name came up and wanted to put a face to it and never got the chance. It means what happened here. Not just the code response, not just the OR, but the whole week, the meeting, all of it, didn't happen in a vacuum. There are people it matters to, people who think you've been standing somewhere that doesn't reflect what you actually are." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the bay had gone from gray to something closer to silver as the afternoon light shifted. "You're going to do this whether I weigh in on it or not," she said. "Yes." Then I'll show up, she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, something more complicated. The expression of a man who had spent a long time being certain about most things, and had recently had that certainty revised in a direction he hadn't anticipated and found, surprisingly, that he didn't resent. Good, he said. She left with the folder under her arm and the discharge paperwork signed, and she made it to the end of the hallway before she stopped and pressed her back against the wall and stayed there for a moment. Not long, just the length of a few deliberate breaths, letting herself feel the weight of the past 2 weeks in its entirety before she set it down and kept walking. What she felt was not triumph. Triumph was not a feeling she trusted, because she had learned that what followed hard things was rarely clean. What she felt was something quieter than that, the solid, unspectacular knowledge that she had gotten through it, that the thing she had been was still the thing she was, and that the ground had shifted substantially beneath her feet and she was still standing on it. She pushed off the wall. 3 floors below, in the administrative records room where the board inquiry team had been working for 5 days, a junior staff member cross-referencing flagged documents opened a misfiled folder under a budget restructuring label dated 16 months prior and found something that had not yet been entered into the official inquiry record, a series of internal emails printed and annotated in Renner's handwriting that outlined not just a plan to remove Olivia from her senior position, but communications with 2 additional board members whose names had not appeared anywhere in the investigation so far. She stared at the pages for a long moment, reading them twice to be certain of what she was seeing. Then she picked up the phone and called the inquiry lead directly, because what she was holding was not a supporting document. It was evidence that the scope of what had been done to Olivia Marsh was wider than anyone had understood, and that the people who had done it were not 2 administrators acting on institutional politics, but a coordinated group who had been working toward a specific outcome for longer than anyone had yet established. And the question that was now sitting in the center of the inquiry, like a weight that had just significantly increased, was exactly how far up the board this had gone, and who had known, and how long they had known it, and whether any of them were still in the building. The inquiry lead's name was Captain Dara Simmons, retired Navy JAG, now working as an independent compliance investigator contracted by the hospital's board oversight committee. She had been brought in specifically because the board wanted someone with no institutional loyalties, which was either a sign of genuine good faith or a sign that the board had understood early that this was going to get complicated and wanted plausible distance from the outcome. She picked up on the second ring. The junior staff member, her name was Priya Anand, 26 years old, 18 months into her first job in hospital administration, and visibly shaking in the way people shake when they have found something they weren't supposed to find. Read the names from the emails carefully, because she understood instinctively that the difference between saying this correctly and saying it incorrectly was the difference between evidence and confusion. Simmons listened without interrupting. When Priya finished, Simmons said, "Don't touch anything else in that folder. Put it back where you found it and stay where you are. I'll be there in 10 minutes. She was there in 7. Oh, Olivia didn't know about the folder that night. She drove home, made dinner she actually ate for once, and called Mara at the usual Sunday time even though it was a Wednesday, because she had been carrying this particular weight alone for 2 weeks, and she needed to hear her daughter's voice without explaining why. Mara answered on the 3rd ring. "Mom, it's Wednesday." "I know," Olivia said. "Is this a bad time?" There was a brief pause, the pause of a daughter reading the particular frequency her mother's voice was broadcasting. "No," Mara said in a different tone. "I've got time. Talk to me." She didn't tell Mara about the complaint or the meeting or the discovery documentation or Bloom's resignation. She told her instead about a patient she'd had years ago, a man who had come into the facility convinced he was fine when he wasn't, and how sometimes the hardest part of the job was not the crisis itself, but the period after, when everyone expected you to feel resolved because the crisis was technically over. Mara was quiet for a moment after that. Then, "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Olivia said. "I'm tired." "Those are different things." "I know they are." "Mom." "I'm okay, Mara." Another pause. "I'm going to come visit next month," Mara said. "I was going to wait until summer, but I'm going to come next month." Olivia looked at the wall. "You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Mara said. "I want to. That's different too." After she hung up, Olivia sat at the kitchen table for a while without moving. It was the kind of quiet that a house builds around a person who has lived in it alone long enough. Not lonely, exactly, but conscious. The specific quiet of a life that has been organized efficiently around absence. She thought about what it had cost her to stay quiet for 4 years while Renner built a case against her in budget memos she was never shown. Not the professional cost. She had calculated that clearly enough. The other cost. The private one. The way you start to edit yourself when you sense that your full self is a liability. The small daily compressions of who you are into something more manageable, more expected, less likely to give someone a mechanism. She had been doing that since she left the service. Not constantly, not dramatically, but in the accumulated small ways that add up over decades to a version of yourself that is functional and capable and not quite complete. She went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. Simmons' report landed on the board chair's desk at 0900 the following Monday. It was 43 pages. Olivia learned this later from Sandra, who had been copied on the executive summary as the nursing union representative with active standing in the inquiry. 43 pages covering a coordinated effort involving Renner, Blum, and 2 board members, a man named Gerald Foss and a woman named Diane Whitaker, who had been quietly supporting the budget restructuring plan that required eliminating the senior nursing track as currently constituted. The plan had a financial logic to it, which was what made it durable. Crestview's senior nursing positions carried elevated compensation and a degree of clinical autonomy that some board members had long viewed as redundant to physician authority. The restructuring would have reclassified those positions, reduced their compensation bands, and replaced the clinical autonomy provisions with stricter physician oversight requirements. It would have saved the institution approximately $3 million over 5 years. It would also have systematically removed the class of nurses who were most capable of doing exactly what Olivia had done in room 14. The plan had been circulating at the board level for 16 months. Renner had been its primary architect. Blum had been her operational partner, the person with enough clinical authority to generate the complaint that would provide the disciplinary precedent the restructuring needed to justify the policy change. Foss and Whitaker had been the votes. They had chosen Olivia specifically, not randomly, not opportunistically. Specifically, because her file was the most vulnerable, because her qualifications were the most unconventional, because the combination of military background and civilian nursing was the easiest thing to frame as non-standard to people who didn't understand what either of those things actually meant. They had been waiting for a mechanism. The emergency response to Voss had been the mechanism they'd decided to use. Simmons's report recommended immediate removal of Renner and Foss from the board, formal censure of Whitaker, pending a separate review of her specific involvement level, referral of Blum's case to the State Medical Board for investigation of professional misconduct, and a full audit of all personnel decisions made by the Nursing Oversight Committee in the past 4 years. The board chair, a woman named Harriet Wu, who had been at Crestview for 2 years and had come from outside the institution specifically because the previous chair had left under unrelated governance concerns, read the report in its entirety before she called anyone. Then she called the hospital's external legal counsel, not Holt, who had already been identified as having advised Blum after the complaint was filed, but a different firm with no prior relationship to the institution. She spent 4 hours on the phone. At 1600, she called an emergency board session. Olivia was on her afternoon shift when Sandra appeared at the nursing station with her phone in her hand and an expression that Olivia had not seen on Sandra Briggs's face before. Not excitement, because Sandra was not an excitable person, but something close to the satisfaction of a woman who had spent 22 years in a job where outcomes were often partial and unsatisfying and had just watched one go all the way. "They're convening tonight," Sandra said. "Emergency session. The report is in." Olivia kept writing what she was writing. "What's the scope?" "Renner, Blum, Foss, Whitaker, all 4. The chair is recommending immediate action on 2 of them tonight and a formal process for the other 2. Sandra paused. "This is real, Olivia. This isn't a slap on the wrist." Olivia set her pen down. "Who found it?" A junior administrator named Priya Anand, 26 years old, had been at the facility for 18 months. Sandra shook her head slightly. "She found a misfiled folder and she called it in when she could have just refiled it and gone home." Olivia thought about that. 26 years old, 18 months in. New enough to not yet have learned the institutional habit of looking away from things that looked like trouble. Is she all right? Olivia asked. Sandra looked at her for a moment. You're asking about the person who found the evidence. She's going to be in a complicated position. She's protected. Simmons flagged her for whistleblower status in the report. Sandra picked up her phone. I'll be at the board session tonight. You don't need to be there. This part doesn't require you. I know, Olivia said, but I'll call you when it's done. I know that too. Sandra left. Wesley, who had been pretending not to listen from 3 feet away, waited approximately 4 seconds before saying, So? So? Olivia said, and went back to work. Sandra called at 21:47. Olivia was home, on the couch, not watching the television that was running in the background. She picked up before the second ring. Renner is out, Sandra said. Immediate removal, effective tonight. Foss resigned before the session ended. He saw the report this afternoon and apparently decided not to wait for the vote. Whitaker is on formal suspension pending the extended review. Blum's case goes to the state medical board next week. Simmons submitted the referral this evening. Olivia was quiet. The board chair also announced a full review of all nursing oversight decisions from the past 4 years, Sandra continued. That means the promotion committee records, the evaluation standards, the compensation band discussions, everything that touched the senior nursing track while Renner had oversight authority. That's going to take a long time, Olivia said. Yes. What's going to happen? A pause. There's one more thing. The chair has requested a meeting with you. Not a disciplinary meeting, not an administrative meeting. She wants to meet with you directly. She specifically said she wanted to hear from you before the board makes any formal statements about the case. Olivia absorbed that. When? She said whenever you're ready. She said to take your time. After she hung up, she sat with the phone in her hand for a moment. The television was running something she wasn't watching. The kitchen light was on, the way she always left it. She thought about Gareth Bloom drafting a complaint in his office with a personnel file he'd pulled before he had a reason to pull it. She thought about Patricia Renner on a conference call with board members, explaining why Olivia Marsh's credentials were non-standard, saying the word with the particular institutional inflection that made it mean something other than what it technically said. She thought about 4 years of small edits, small compressions, the daily work of being in a place where something about her was always slightly too much or slightly wrong shape. She thought about room 14 at 1847 on the evening that changed everything, and the specific quality of clarity she had felt when she walked through that door and saw his color, and knew, not thought, not assessed, not calculated, but knew, what was happening and what needed to happen next. That clarity was not a credential. It was not something any committee could grant or revoke. It was the accumulated result of 8 years in uniform and 22 years of shifts and every patient she had ever sat with in the space between what was wrong and what was possible. And it had been there, intact and functional, every single day that someone somewhere in this institution had been working to find a way to use it against her. She put the phone on this table and went to bed. She met with Harriet Wu the following Thursday in an office on the 4th floor that was not the administrative conference room where the complaint hearing had been held. Wu had chosen a different room, and Olivia noted the choice without drawing attention to it. Wu was 60, black, with the direct manner of someone who had spent her career in governance and had learned to distinguish between the institutional performance of accountability and the actual thing. She stood when Olivia came in, which was not something people in board positions typically did, and she said, "Thank you for coming. Sit anywhere you like." Olivia sat. Wu did not open with an apology, which Olivia appreciated. She opened with, "I've read your complete file, your civilian file and your service record. I want to make sure I'm speaking to you with full context." "All right," Olivia said. "What was done to you was deliberate and it was sustained," Wu said. "Not just the complaint, the 4 years of groundwork before it. I want you to know that the board understands this, and that the process going forward is going to reflect that understanding." Olivia said nothing. She was listening. "The audit of the nursing oversight decisions is going to take approximately 6 months," Wu continued. "At the conclusion of that audit, the board will make formal determinations about any staff affected by decisions made during Renner's oversight tenure. You will be one of those cases reviewed." She paused. "That review is going to be thorough, and I don't think you need me to tell you what it's likely to conclude. I appreciate that, Olivia said, but I want to ask you something directly. Please? The people who built this, Renner, Foss, the others, they had a financial argument, $3 million in savings. That argument didn't disappear because the people making it are gone. She held Wu's gaze. When the audit is done and the formal reviews are complete, is the board going to look at that number and start looking for a cleaner way to get to it? Wu was quiet for a moment. It was not a deflecting quiet. It was the quiet of a woman taking a question seriously. That's the right question to ask, she said, and I can't give you a guarantee because I don't control what this board looks like in 5 years. She was direct about it. What I can tell you is that the audit is going to produce a documented case for what the senior nursing structure actually delivers in patient outcome terms. And I intend to make sure that case is the one this board uses when it makes staffing decisions going forward. That's an honest answer, Olivia said. It's the only kind I have. They looked at each other across the desk. Two women who had both spent long careers in institutions that had frequently found their full selves inconvenient and who had both, by different routes, gotten to a place where they could sit in a room and say the thing directly. There's one more thing, Wu said. The formal board statement about this case is going to be released next week. I wanted you to know in advance that your name will be included, not as the subject of a complaint, but as the individual whose treatment identified the governance failure. The language will be explicit about what happened and what the consequences have been. Olivia considered that. People will want to make it a story, she said. Probably, Wu agreed. You can decide how much of that you engage with. That's entirely your choice. I appreciate that. She stood. Wu stood. Ms. Marsh. Wu extended her hand. The institution failed you. I won't pretend it didn't. What I can do is make sure the failure is documented honestly and that what comes next is built on something better. Olivia shook her hand. That's enough, she said. That's what I came here for. The event Voss had mentioned happened 6 weeks after his discharge, on a clear Saturday morning in late April, at a facility on the base at Camp Lewick that served as the battalion's formal assembly ground. He had told her it wasn't going to be small. He hadn't told her it would be this. There were Marines in rows, not a ceremony-sized group, not a token gathering, but the kind of assembly that required chairs and a sound system and advanced coordination, the kind of assembly that a battalion commander convenes when he has decided that something matters enough to make it official. Olivia arrived with Mara, who had come down from Portland 4 days earlier and had spent those 4 days asking careful questions and listening to answers and arriving somewhere around day 2 at a revised understanding of her mother that she was still integrating. You never told me, Mara had said, on the second evening after Olivia had shown her the service record. You were 4 when I came home, Olivia said, and then you were 8, and then 12. There was never a right time. Mom, I'm 32. I know, Olivia said. I was getting around to it. Mara had looked at her for a long time. Then, you've been doing this alone for a really long time. I had help, Olivia said, just not from people who knew the whole picture. I want to know the whole picture, Mara said. I know you do, Olivia said. We'll start at the beginning. They'd spent the next 2 evenings doing exactly that. Now Mara sat beside her in the second row of the assembly ground, and Olivia watched the Marines filling the seats and the space around the seats, and she felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Not pride, not quite, because pride implied a performance, and she had never been performing any of this. Something older and quieter than pride. Recognition, maybe. The particular quality of being seen correctly after a long time of being seen wrong. Voss stood at the front of the assembly. He was out of the wheelchair now, standing on his own with the careful posture of a man respecting his own recovery, which Olivia noted with professional satisfaction. He had color back. His eyes were clear. He spoke without notes. He began with the battalion, its history, its deployments, the specific tradition of the 3rd Expeditionary's medical support relationship with combat medics who had served embedded with special operations units. He spoke about what those medics had done in conditions that he described with the spare precision of someone who had been there, the words chosen not for effect, but for accuracy, and the accuracy was more affecting than anything decorated would have been. He spoke about what it meant to underestimate someone. I did it, he said. On the first day. I looked at a woman in a hospital corridor and I made a calculation based on what I could see, and I was wrong in every way it's possible to be wrong. Not because I lacked information, because I looked at the information I had and I organized it according to assumptions I'd never examined. I assumed her history was contained in what was visible. I assumed the institution she was working in had placed her where her qualifications deserved. He paused. Both of those assumptions were wrong. And had I been right? Had she been the person I assumed she was when I pointed at her and told her to get me someone who'd actually been to war, I would not be standing here. He looked directly at Olivia. She had been to war, he said. She had been there before I was. She had done things in conditions that would qualify as the hardest experiences this unit has ever documented, and then she had come home and spent 22 years doing it again in different clothes, in a building full of people who thought they knew what she was. The assembly was completely still. What I want to say, he said, is not just thank you. Thank you is insufficient. What I want to say is that the way we recognize service, the way we assign worth, the way we decide who has earned the right to occupy a room, those systems fail. They fail individuals. They fail institutions. And when they fail, it's usually the people who are most capable who absorb the cost, because capable people find ways to continue functioning even when the system is working against them. He stopped. That doesn't make it right. It makes it invisible. And invisible is the most dangerous kind of wrong. He turned toward the side of the stage where an aide was holding a presentation case. The 3rd Expeditionary Strike Group has a tradition, he said. When someone performs an act of service that falls outside the visible record, service that the formal channels didn't see, didn't document, or actively worked against, we have a mechanism for making it visible. It doesn't happen often. It's not supposed to happen often. He took the case from the aide and walked to the edge of the stage and down the 3 steps to the ground level, which Olivia could see cost him something. The careful management of his movement, the slight tightening of his jaw. And he walked to where she was sitting in the 2nd row and he stood in front of her and he opened the case. Inside was a unit citation. Not a civilian commendation, but a full military unit citation from the 3rd Expeditionary Strike Group, bearing the battalion seal and Voss's signature and the signatures of several other names she didn't immediately recognize, but would later, when she read them carefully, identify as former commanding officers of units she had served with 20 years ago. Beside the citation, a coin. The battalion coin, in the specific heavy brass of the ones that were made for the unit in 2002 and had not been redesigned since, the ones that meant what they meant only to people who knew what they meant. You were one of us, Voss said. Not loudly. He said it the way he'd said things that mattered throughout their entire history, which was quietly and directly. You have always been one of us. We are formally and publicly correcting the record. She stood. She didn't have a speech. She had known she wouldn't have a speech because she had made the decision somewhere around day 3 of everything that if this happened, she was going to stand up and receive it the way she had given everything else, without performing it, without dressing it up beyond what it actually was. She took the coin. She held the citation. She looked at him. You waited long enough, she said, and something broke open in the room. Not the audience, not the ceremony, but the particular tightness that formal occasions carry. The held breath of several hundred people who had been sitting at attention and suddenly exhaled at once, and with it came something that sounded like laughter and sounded like release and was probably both. Voss did smile then. Actually smiled, and it changed his face in the way that smiles change the faces of people who rarely use them. Mara was crying. Olivia saw it in her peripheral vision and filed it away, because she was going to need to think about that later, the image of her daughter's face in that moment, the specific shape of what Mara was understanding about who her mother was and had always been. She didn't cry. That was not a thing she was going to do in front of 300 Marines. She shook Voss's hand, which was not a civilian gesture but a military one, and he held it a moment longer than a handshake requires, which was his version of everything else he could have said and chose not to. The State Medical Board's investigation into Bloom concluded 4 months later. The findings included improper use of institutional authority to initiate a complaint for purposes unrelated to patient care, professional conduct unbecoming a medical administrator, and coordinated action with board members to manipulate personnel decisions. His license was suspended for 18 months, and he was barred from holding administrative authority at any licensed medical facility for 5 years. Renner's case took longer because the scope was broader. The formal governance review produced findings that extended beyond Crestview to 2 other institutions where she had held oversight roles and where similar patterns of personnel targeting had occurred. She resigned from all board positions before the formal findings were issued, which her attorney advised would limit the civil exposure. It limited some of it, not all of it. Gerald Foss's resignation was accepted. The formal board review found that his involvement, while real, had been primarily passive. He had voted in support of the restructuring plan without independently driving the targeting strategy. The board issued a formal censure and barred him from future board service at the institution. Diane Whitaker, whose involvement was found to be the least direct, received a formal reprimand and was not permitted to return to the nursing oversight structure. Priya Anand, the junior administrator who had found the folder, was offered a promoted position in the compliance office 6 months after the inquiry concluded. She took it. She told the compliance director at her first team meeting that she had almost refiled the folder and gone home, and that the only reason she hadn't was that something about the handwriting on the annotations had made her feel that it mattered whether someone looked at it or not. The compliance director said that was exactly the quality of judgment their office was looking for. The nursing audit concluded in autumn. The formal findings identified 11 personnel decisions made under Renner's oversight authority that required reconsideration, of which 6 involved compensation adjustments and 3 involved promotional reclassifications. Olivia's file was one of the 6. The audit found that her compensation band had been deliberately set below the appropriate range for her qualifications for a period of 4 years, calculated the difference, and recommended remediation. She didn't find out the amount until Sandra called her on a Tuesday afternoon. "That's the number," Sandra said. Olivia was quiet for a moment. "That's 4 years of back pay, plus the adjustment going forward." She thought about Renner in the promotion committee meeting 4 years ago, voting against her with the language of non-standard credentials. And she thought about what that vote had actually been. Not a professional assessment, but a financial maneuver dressed in the language of professional assessment. And the difference between what it pretended to be and what it was had cost Olivia 4 years of compensation and 4 years of the low-grade erosion that comes from knowing something is wrong and being unable to prove it. "I'll need to review the documentation," she said. "Obviously," Sandra said. "But Olivia, it's real. It's going to happen." She called Mara that evening, not on a Sunday. On a Tuesday, the second time in her life she had called on an off day, which Mara answered with, "Mom, what happened?" "Nothing bad," Olivia said. "Something good, actually," she told her. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, "What are you going to do with it?" "I don't know yet," Olivia said. "Pay off the house. Maybe take a real vacation." "You've never taken a real vacation." "I know." "Where would you go?" She thought about it. "Somewhere without anyone who needs me to make a decision," she said, and Mara laughed, which was what she'd wanted. "I'm coming for Christmas," Mara said. "That's not a question." "I know," Olivia said. "I'll have the room ready." She was back on the ward the next morning. Not because she had nowhere else to be, not because she didn't have leave saved, not because the institution required her immediate presence. She was back because this was the work. And the work was still what it was. The same patients, the same 12-hour rhythm, the same demands of being present for people in the worst moments they would experience. And nothing that had happened over the past months had changed what she felt about that. What had changed was something smaller and more significant. The way she moved through the facility, the way the staff nodded at her, the particular quality of the interactions at the nursing station, where Wesley still put coffee beside her without announcing it, but where now the gesture meant something it hadn't before, carrying the weight of everything they'd both been through and didn't need to articulate. New residents rotated through every 6 weeks, and the current cohort had started the previous month. One of them, a second-year internal medicine resident named Dr. James Okafor, 28 years old, sharp and quick, and prone to the particular overconfidence of people who have been told they're exceptional for so long that they've stopped questioning the assessment, had been on shift 3 days into his rotation when his patient presented with signs that he had categorized as anxiety-related and dismissed. Olivia had stopped him in the hallway. She didn't raise her voice. She said, calmly and directly, that she wanted him to go back and look at the patient's heart rate pattern in context of the medications she'd been given the previous shift, and that she thought he might find the picture look different when he did. He had given her the look that young physicians sometimes give nurses who question their assessments. Not malicious, more reflexive. The look of someone who has learned a hierarchy and is applying it automatically. She held his gaze without shifting. He went back. He found what she'd told him he would find. The patient went for imaging. The imaging found a small pulmonary embolism that the anxiety diagnosis would have sent home untreated. Okafor found her at the nursing station afterward. He looked like a man who was integrating something uncomfortable and doing it honestly. "How did you know?" he asked. "The heart rate pattern," she said. "And the clinical picture didn't match the presentation cleanly enough. When things don't match cleanly, you go back." "I looked at that chart for 10 minutes. "I know. You were looking for confirmation of what you already thought." She said it without judgment. "That's not a character flaw. It's a habit. You'll spend your whole career working against it." He was quiet for a moment. "You've seen that before." "More times than I can count." She turned back to her work. "You did the right thing when it mattered. That's what you take forward." He stood there for another second. Then, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask?" "The people who filed the complaint against you, the administrative thing." He hesitated. "Everyone on the floor knows what happened. I don't understand how you kept working through it, how you stayed focused." She considered the question. It was a real question, asked by a person young enough to still want a formula, an answer that would work as a rule. "I kept my eyes on the patient," she said simply. "Every time I felt the other thing pulling at me, I looked at whoever was in the next room and I remembered that they didn't know anything about what was happening in the administrative office. And they didn't need to know. And what they needed was what I came here to do." She paused. "The noise around the work is always going to be there. Complaints, politics, people who want to manage you into a shape that's easier for them. The work itself doesn't change. You decide which one you're actually here for." He nodded slowly. The nod of someone filing something carefully. "Thank you," he said. "Go check on your patients," she said. He went. Voss came in for his 3-month follow-up in May. Dr. Ose did the imaging, reviewed the repair, and told him he was cleared for graduated return to physical activity, which he received with the careful neutrality of someone who had a list in his head and was going to work through it methodically, regardless of what graduated meant. He stopped by the ward before he left. She was at the nursing station. He stopped across the counter from her, out of uniform today. Just clothes, civilian clothes, which gave him a different quality, a slightly less armored version of the presence she'd been looking at for 3 months. "Osi says I'm clear," he said. "I know. I saw the imaging when it came through." "Of course you did." He said it without edge, almost warmly. "How are you?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Better than I was 6 months ago," she said, still figuring out what that means. "That's a fair place to be." They were quiet for a moment. In the hallway behind him, a cart went by. Someone's monitor beeped twice, the ordinary percussion of a ward in its normal rhythm. "I'm going back to the battalion next week," he said. "I know. Falk called to confirm your discharge paperwork." "Of course she did." He put his hands on the counter, not leaning on it, just placing them there, the gesture of a man making a point of staying for a moment longer than necessary. "I have a question." She waited. "The training program," he said, "the one the hospital is developing, for emergency medical decision-making in high-stress situations. Halbrook mentioned they're looking for someone to help design the curriculum." He held her gaze. "Someone who understands what those situations actually require." She looked at him steadily. "That's not a question." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She thought about it for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because the thing she was being offered deserved a moment of consideration rather than a reflexive answer either way. A curriculum. The chance to take what she knew and build it into something that would outlast any individual decision made in any individual room. To put the knowledge in a form that could help the next person who walked into a situation like room 14 and needed to know what to do before the physician arrived. The chance to be officially and on record exactly what she had always actually been. "Tell Halbrook I'll set up a meeting," she said. Something settled in Voss's face. Not triumph. He wasn't a man who wore triumph, more the particular expression of someone who has watched a thing reach the place it always should have been. "Good," he said. He picked up his jacket from the counter where he'd set it, paused. "Marsh." She looked at him. "For what it's worth," he said, and his voice was quieter than his public voice, the voice he used when it was just two people in a room and the performance wasn't required. "I think you were always going to be fine. Whatever they did, whatever they tried, you were always going to be standing at the end of it." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the morning he'd arrived in the intake bay, pointing a finger and telling her to get him someone who'd actually been to war. She thought about room 14 at 1847 and the elevator and the corridor outside the fire stairwell and the conference room with its arranged chairs and the assembly ground with Mara crying in the second row. "I didn't know that," she said honestly. "There were days I genuinely didn't know that." He nodded. "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." He left. She watched him go, down the hallway, around the corner, out of sight, and then she turned back to the nursing station and picked up the chart she'd been working on before he appeared, because there was still a full shift ahead of her and the patients were still the point, and the work was still what she was here for. But she stood there for just a moment before she started writing, and she thought about something she rarely let herself think about clearly: what it had actually cost to be this person, in this institution, in this body of work, for 22 years. The accumulated weight of being seen as less than she was, of compressing herself into acceptable shapes, of doing the right thing in rooms where no one was watching and trusting that the work itself would somehow be enough. It had cost a lot. She was not going to pretend otherwise, not even to herself. But she was also standing here, whole, credentialed, undeniable, with a battalion citation in the drawer at home, and a curriculum to design and a daughter coming for Christmas, and a 3-month imaging report that said the man she had kept alive was going to be fine. She was standing here after everything that had been aimed at her, and she had not been diminished by it. She had been, if anything, made more visible, more accurately seen, more completely herself than she had been in years. That was not a small thing. The people who had built the plan to remove her had believed that her history was a vulnerability, that the gaps between what she was on paper and what she was in practice could be exploited, that the very qualities that made her exceptional could be reframed as liabilities by the right combination of institutional language and strategic patience. They had believed this because they had never really looked at her. They had looked at a category, a cost line, a non-standard credential, and they had built their plan against that abstraction. They had been wrong in the specific way that people are always wrong when they mistake the shape of someone for the substance of them. She picked up her pen. Down the hall, a patient called for a nurse. She went.